In this video, we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. So, we are at the beginning of the 15th of August of 2025, Friday, and today is the day when everything could end. And of course, first of all, we're talking about the special military operation. Most likely, this is the most important day of the entire special military operation. I would like to remind you that today the President of the United States of America is going to have a meeting with the President of the Russian Federation on the territory of Alaska, where most likely, and according to different sources, they're going to talk just about one question, about one issue: how to resolve the conflict on the territory of Ukraine, how to settle the conflict peacefully. And during the previous 12 hours, both the Russians and the Americans made several statements regarding regarding this meeting. Donald Trump said that his upcoming meeting with Vladimir Putin in Alaska will be important for both Russia and the United States. Trump is confident that both Putin and Zelensky will agree to a settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. Following the Alaska summit, Trump wants to hold a meeting with his participation, as well as Putin, Zelensky, and some people from Europe. He hopes to lay the foundation for the next meeting on Ukraine at the Anchorage summit, which could be held against in Alaska. Later, Trump will consider the idea of reducing the number of US forces in Europe for the sake of settling the conflict in Ukraine. Another important thing is that US President does not want to impose new sanctions against Russia. His priority is diplomacy. Donald Trump's priority in resolving the conflict in Ukraine remains negotiations and diplomacy, but other tools are also available. Of course, there are sanctions and many other measures that the president could apply if he was forced to, but did not want to. So as we can see, we can say that more or less Donald Trump is more or less peaceful before the beginning of this negotiation process. When talking about the Russian Federation, they also made their statements. At the Russia-US summit in Alaska, issues related to the Ukraine settlement will be discussed. No documents signing are expected following the Putin-Trump summit in Alaska. This is very important, that nothing will be resolved today. Today we're going to see most likely just a very good friendship of two presidents. It would be a mistake to jump ahead and predict the results of the Russian-US summit in Alaska. The preparation for the Putin-Trump summit was carried out in a short time frame. All parameters were met. Witkov's visit to Russia was productive. These signals allowed for the preparation of the meeting between the leaders of Russia and the United States of America. So we can see that the Russians are also friendly. So both the Russians and the Americans are friendly, as if they were best friends ever. Now let's move to Ukraine. As for Zelensky, during the previous 12 hours, nothing special was published about the state, about the reaction, and so on. The only interesting thing that worries our attention is that US State Department published a very interesting article regarding human rights violations in Ukraine in 2024. Very interesting that this article was published right exactly before the beginning of this meeting. And according to this article, according to this analysis, the situation in Ukraine is very, very difficult. Very important to note that according to this article, they don't forget Gonzalo Lira, the death of American journalist Gonzalo Lira in a pretrial detention center in Kharkiv, and the arrest of Evgeny Shevchenko, accused of treason for pro-Russian calls and statements, were recalled. So lots of very interesting details were published in this agreement, which is obviously something like an attack on Zelensky and his regime.
Og har du lagt mærke til, at der er mange små
Ja, der er...
kalve? Hedder det ikke? Kald det en kalv.
Nej, vi kalder det en kalv. Det er et føl.
Now let's discuss the situation on the ground. During the previous 12 hours, we have additional changes. We have very interesting details. So let's start. And first, let's talk about the Zaporozhye direction, because after a very long operational pause, the Russians resumed their attempts to attack further deep inside of the territory of Zaporozhye. During the previous night, the pro-Ukrainian resources of the 118th Separate Mechanized Brigade published this video where we can see how Russians were attacking Ukrainian positions in the area of Mala-Takhmachka. So once again, according to this update, according to several statements that were published by different resources. The Russians during the previous days carried out another attempt to attack the settlement of Mala Takmachka with armored vehicles, tanks, and so on. As for now, it's very difficult to say whether the Russians managed to answer the settlement of Mala Takmachka and to improve their positions. The only thing we have is geolocations in the vicinity of the settlement without adding additional changes on the ground. So the Russians made an attempt, but very difficult to say whether the Russians managed to improve their positions or not. Now let's talk about the South Donetsk direction. Very interesting area. We continue receiving updates exactly from this area. I would like to remind you that just yesterday the pro-Russian resources published this video where we can see how Russians were fighting for the settlement of Alexandriivka-Klivtsova. The video where we can see lots of artillery strikes, actions of the armored forces of the Russian Federation, of course, many flags raised in different parts of the settlement. Yesterday, based on this video and based on the report of the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, most of the mappers adjusted their maps, coloring the territory of Andreevka-Klivtsova completely in Russian favor. And today the Russians continue their offensive operation, and we have this video where we can see how another Russian drone was flying above the settlement of Alexandrograd and how Russians were dropping papers, lists, and documents suggesting Ukrainians to surrender. This is a part of Russian behavior, a pattern of Russian behavior. First, they suggest Ukrainians to surrender, and then they begin offensive operation. Furthermore, most likely this video is 2 or 3 days old because several pro-Russian resources this morning made adjustments on map. According to them, the Russians answered the settlement of Alexandrograd from the south and the southwest. So very likely that these upcoming days the Russians will be able to take under complete control the settlement of Alexandrograd, and this is going to be the second let's say village in this direction came under Russian control during the previous days, and there were going to be just one village left. We're talking about Kamyshevacha, and once again we're talking about the western part of the Donetsk region. As for the settlement of Kamyshevacha, nothing was published during the previous days, so as for now the Russians are not focused and are not tasked to move in this direction. Furthermore, according to information we have and according to very reliable resources, the armored forces of the Russian Federation continue their offensive operation deep inside of the Dnipro region. The sources are saying that the Russians managed to enter the village of Vorona and to force the Ukrainians to fall back from this territory. You know that this is a very interesting piece of news. Another important detail is that at the same time from the settlement of Yanvarska, the armored forces of the Russian Federation continue their offensive operation in the area of Novoselovka, and currently there are very heavy clashes for this territory. So as we can see, during the previous 24 or 12 hours, the Russians shown or revealed their positions or their activities exactly inside of this pocket, which means that the Russians both continue their offensive operation and the Russians continue their offensive operation deep inside of the Dnipro region, which is unexpected and very interesting. I would like to remind you that according to different sources, the Russians and Americans came to the conclusion that it's a good idea to make something like exchange of territories. The Russians will take under complete control Donbas region, and the Russians at the same time will return Ukrainians Kharkiv region, territories of Kharkiv region, Sumy regions, and the territories of Dnipro regions. So that is why there is no need, or at least it's not like good idea, but there is no need to attack deep inside of Dnipro, because anyway, according to possible agreements, you may be forced to return these territories back in the future. But we see that despite this part of piece of agreement, we see that the Russians continue advancing, and the most important is that the Russians are advancing not just towards the first let's say villages along the border. The Russians, according to this update that we just discussed, moved further deep inside of the Dnipro River region, and they began clashes for the second layer of villages and towns along the border between the Dnipro region and the Donetsk region. This is very important. So the Russians are moving deeper. And it seems that the Russians may be tasked to move further in the direction of the settlement of Velika Mikhailovka, which is more or less huge settlement in this direction, which will allow the Russians to concentrate their units for possible offensive operation further in the northwestern or the western directions in the area of the Zaporozhye region and the Dnipro region itself. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Pokrovsk agglomeration. During the previous 12 hours, we haven't received many updates, and we were receiving just from the area of the Russian breakthrough. But despite additional icons, additional clarifications, as you can see, we have no additional changes on the ground, which means that both the Ukrainians managed to stabilize the situation, or the Russians are not trying to risk, because the Ukrainians continue redeploying units in this direction. Very interesting article was published by pro-Ukrainian resource, Ukrainian counterattack, or by the neutral, let's say, expert. Ukrainian counterattacks in the Pokrovsk direction seem to have failed. The decision to counterattack, requiring the greater number of reinforcements from other areas instead of trying to just stabilize or contain the Russian breakthrough, has now left Ukrainian defenses exposed in the other directions. While Pokrovsk may have stabilized, the front line is now moving rapidly in Russian favor in the Konstantinovka, Liman, and Kupiansk direction. So this is exactly what we were talking about yesterday. The Ukrainians redeployed lots of units in this area with the purpose to slow down the Russians. Maybe they managed to achieve this task, but at the same time, Ukrainians currently have huge problems in the Konstantinovka direction, in the Liman direction, and of course in the Kupiansk direction, and most likely the Russians managed to break through Ukrainian defense there. Anyway, let's continue with the Pokrovsk direction, because while the Russians were stopped, let's say, to the west of Vladimirovka, Shakhova, Toretska, Sofievka, we see that the Russians continue offensive operation to the east of the same line. So the Russians during the previous 24 hours once again managed to improve their positions. At least this information was confirmed by neutral mappers. And you know that despite the fact that the, let's say, western offensive was stopped by the Ukrainians, the eastern offensive, the eastern pincer, continue developing. The Russians are moving there not so fast as they moved to the west of this area, but the most important, that the Russians didn't stop. The Russians continue their offensive. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 9th of August of 2025, and almost every single day we were adding territories in this area, and we were coloring different tree lines, fortifications, more and more in the Russian favor and the Russian control. So as we discussed in the previous videos, as for now the Russians have just one problem in this area. We're talking about this pocket, the villages of Sofievka, Shakhova, Vladimirovka. So, and Ukrainians control this territory, and the Russians are tasked to establish complete control over the territory. And if the Russians are able to do this, then Ukrainians most likely will never be able to restore control over this territory and to stabilize the situation. Furthermore, we got report that Ukrainians announced total evacuation from this part of the Donbas region, which means that the Russians are moving and that the Russians are heading towards this area. The settlements of Andreevka, Varvarovka, Novandreevka, Staroraiska were announced for mass evacuation in coming days or maybe even hours. As for the Konstantinovka direction, the Russians are about to finish the battle for the settlement of Klibanbyk. They managed to finish everything they need. We need just to wait for 1 or 2 or 3 days, and we will color this territory completely under Russian control. So, with the end of the battle for the Klibanbykski water is over, the Russians intensify their activities in the northwestern part of the city of Chasiv Yar. The Russians reported that they have almost finished the battle for the settlement of Nikolaevka. Several groups of the armed forces of Ukraine were caught in cauldron the territory of the settlement, and of course, according to information we have, the Russians continue advancing in the fields towards the village of Viralyubovka. As we discussed in the previous videos, the most important, and the Russians are tasked to get for as close as possible to the main arteria between the cities in the Konstantinovka agglomeration. We're talking about N20 road. They need to shorten the distance, and of course the Russians need to establish complete FPV drone control, fire control, sabotage, and reconnaissance group control. This will allow them, the Russians, to cut and control the city of Konstantinovka also in coming days. The city of Liman the Russians are about to get the city of Liman from 3 directions. During the previous 24 hours, as you can see, additional changes on the ground were recorded. So this is another area where the Russians show a very big dynamic. Almost every single day we were coloring the territory of this region in Russian favor or in favor of contested zone or contested area. And we see that slowly but step by step the Russians are moving further and further and further. Today, according to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the village of Zarechne, the Russians managed to outflank the settlement of Shandrigolova, and the Russians managed to outflank the settlement of Kolodzi. It seems that, according to this report, in coming days we might see complete collapse of Ukrainian defense on the way towards the settlement of Liman, and everything along this red line would be taken by the Russians. And this is going to be already the beginning of the battle for the city of Liman itself, despite the gap in distance between positions and the city itself. As for the Kupiansk direction, I would like to remind you that yesterday several pro-Russian resources reported that the Russians managed to break through Ukrainian defense and to answer the settlement of Petropavlovka from the east. Today this information was confirmed by different neutral experts and neutral mappers. Ukrainian lines in Kupiansk direction have also begun to collapse. And I would like to remind you once again that this collapse most likely is connected with the situation that Ukrainians were forced to take some units from the Kupiansk direction in the direction of the city and the Pokrovsk agglomeration, and that led to complete collapse and to very poor situation for the Ukrainians in this area. And the Russians decided to take this advantage and they began offensive as well. So we are waiting additional updates exactly from the Kupiansk direction in coming 24 hours. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my